Welcome to Econ Roots, a podcast on the history of economic thought brought to you by CEPOS and your host, Stefan Sløk-Madsen. As a bonus to our regular seasons, we aim to bring you exciting interviews with relevant and stimulating economists and scholars within or related to the field of economics. We call these Econ Roots Talk. In today's talk, recorded at the APEE Conference 2022 in Las Vegas, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Siri A. Terjesen, who is Associate Dean, Research and External Relations, Founding Executive Director of the Madden Center for Value Creation, and Phil Smith Professor of Entrepreneurship at Florida Atlantic University, and Professor at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, Norway. Dr. Terjesen is a nationally recognized expert in higher education, strategic management, entrepreneurship, and philanthropy. She has received numerous awards for teaching. She is a much-used policy and strategy expert by both business and national and international government agencies. Dr. Terjesen's research includes over 80 articles, 2 books, many white papers, and manuscripts. She is amongst the world's top 2% most cited scholars, and her over 13,000 citations in Google Scholar include publications in the best journals within management. Before academia, she worked in consulting and was a top athlete. In today's talk, we ask her what, if anything, the history of economic thought and economic classics can teach business school students. We also take this much treasured opportunity to talk about gender diversity in boardrooms, a topic Dr. Terjesen knows intimately well and has published important research on. Full disclosure, Dr. Terjesen served on Stefans Ph.D. committee and was a hard but fair evaluator.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule here at APEE, Siri, to talk to me and our listeners about a couple of topics that are really interesting to hear your thoughts on. So the first one is, what is the relevance of the classics of economics in management thought and teaching?
This is something I've been thinking about a lot because actually in my undergraduate degree, my MBA, and even my PhD in strategy, I didn't get a lot of classic economic thought. I did, I guess, in undergrad in micro and macro econ. And boy, it's more relevant than ever, right? Even these ideas from the 18th and 19th centuries, and even the fact that those ideas came about because we were trying to move away from monarchies. Well, now when we have this era of big government, the ideas of demand and supply and competitive advantage are more relevant than ever in the classroom. And then I would also say in how we run our business schools and how we run our universities. If we adapt these really, Keynesian policies of subsidizing so many different activities, then we lose the market. And as it turns out, well, there's a global market for education. So our students can go to another university, to another business school.
Yeah, but that's really interesting. So there's actually also a thought, there's a relevance of these ideas even in how we do education, basically. I thought that's really interesting.
I think that's really important. And I think you get some of that discussion, for example, in the higher education literature on accountability when, for example, like in my state, Florida, you get funding from the state based on your performance on these metrics. So you have to perform. Yeah. And you sort of have to let the market work on some of those.
Yeah, lovely. So how do we go about teaching classics, the classics of economic thought to a business school audience? Because, I'm a business school major myself. I liked it, but I don't think a lot of my classmates was that interested. So how do we do that?
I think that's a great question. And it's like $1 million question, right? Because we want to get these ideas out there. And there's a limited time when people can be sponges and be in business school classes, whether online, in person, hybrid, part-time, full-time. And I think there's a lot of different ways. First of all, from just theories of pedagogy and andragogy, which is adult learning, we know that people learn in different ways, so we need to capture them. And then we also know, for example, I have 2 9-year-olds and an 11-year-old, and they've had all these innovative teaching methods, especially the last 3 years since we moved to Florida. So we need to compete with, really the mind share of students and get in there. And again, different ways. For me, I really value individualism. And I think if we start a class where we position, and as I do, the student as the CEO of their own life and how they can make good decisions and take responsibility for those, that's important. It also puts the student in the driver's seat to introduce him or herself to the class, provides a basis for lots of friendships later. I think that's really important. And then also give them examples, many different examples of individuals who are CEOs, albeit of different areas, right? Could be corporations, could be government. And we just expose the students to that. So I've always done that since the first class I taught at the London School of Economics about 22 years ago, to the classes that I'm running now by having entrepreneurs come in, especially in person, or go and visit. So when I was in DC, I would take the students to Cato, to American Enterprise. We even went to the White House. We went to Mount Vernon. There's entrepreneurs and there's classic economics in each of those environments, and gave students the exposure to those ideas. And I think those are those moments in a student's college career when they look back on and, wow, we learned about Swedish innovation in the private sector at the House of Sweden on the banks of the Potomac. And then after the lecture, we, went to the top of the embassy and on the roof and overlooked the Potomac. That's something special, right? So that's the first thing. Another thing is, obviously, using economic freedom resources. Fraser Institute has some great stuff, but combining that with letting students tell their own stories. I've been so fortunate to have so many students whose parents and grandparents fled communist countries, and even sometimes they did. And when they can share those stories with one another, they become more real than just statistics on a paper. So I think that's pretty important. Another one is because I've been running entrepreneurship centers for the last few years, and that's so important because no matter where a student's mindset comes in, when you start a venture, you begin to realize the bureaucracy and rent seeking that others will take, and just all the paperwork. For example, in DC, you've got people who live in 3 different states, and you might have operations in 3 different states within just a couple feet apart, and that's going to require paperwork in Virginia, Maryland, DC, et cetera. All these labyrinth regulations that students don't realize, whether they're starting like a mobile nail manicure bar, cannabis, even biodegradable plastic straws. I mean, all these ventures have had something, and I think that students really develop an appreciation of the market because they've worked so hard and they don't want others to extract that value.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. A couple of points there. I remember I sometimes have a guy in who does a lot of tendering to the public sector, and the students almost doesn't believe what he's saying. Like that there's this whole system set up and all. And it's such an eye opener for them. And based on that, it's very easy to, for instance, teach something like Coase or Williamson and transaction cost economics and these very classic stuff, but all of a sudden put up on something real that they'll get to work with, right? So I think that's really interesting.
That actually, if I jump on that raises an interesting point about the balance of readings. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a diversity of thought here. But yes, some of those classic reads, like I just reread some great stuff from Hayek and Friedman last week, is quite relevant. But I wonder if students can have that fully as, the meal and the reading in class. Yeah. Because if you're, for example, talking about making tin, that's not so relevant for students as, for example, all the components in their iPhone or how their apparel reach them, the supply chain.
Yeah, I agree. But and it is hard sometimes to get them to do this. I sometimes use the introduction of The Limits of Liberty by Buchanan when I teach innovation, because he has this very simple point. Well, it's not a simple point, but about how you can price goods and services, but you can also price the rights to goods and services. And I never really found a good business school text that actually talks about this. I'm using this text, but of course it's sort of like, why are we reading this? This guy's talking about society. And so it's like, yeah, well, if you want to innovate, right? I mean, one way to innovate is separating use rights from ownership rights, right? So, but it is a little bit hard, to force them to read these kind of things, because that's not what they went to school for, right? Do you get that pushback sometimes?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes it's even the quality of the copy, right, that they're reading, whether it's PDF or printed, but it feels old. And there's something classic to that. And some students really leap onto it, but then they want to know how it relates to them, right? So if I'm going to Copenhagen Business School or another business school and I want to start a business next year, how can I use these ideas from this industry and even 200 years ago and apply it to where I want to go in the future?
That leads me to another question that I really been dying to ask you, because do you think some business school students take some of these insights for granted, like the idea of competitive advantage and division of labor and some of these very basic concepts that goes back to Smith and Ricardo and so on? Do you think business schools just take them for granted sometimes?
And maybe don't focus on them? That's a good question. I think we need to look and see where the credit to those ideas is in textbooks and the emphasis on those. But then what is shocking to me sometimes is how quickly the students, for example, will look at something like they want better mobility in Paris, so that people can easily get to work and have public options. And then they so quickly jump to, well, the government needs to subsidize all of these, right? And, and then that this could create more income for all these different people, but they don't think necessarily where that income is going to come from, which is taxes. Part of that's also that those students don't pay taxes. So if students make enough money in their ventures, then they pay taxes. But most students in the U.S. aren't working full-time enough, undergraduate students in particular, to be paying taxes. So they don't see those items and think about them. It's only when they go out in the world, which is also part of extracurricular. There's a fine line between what happens in the classroom, which is important and needs to support the learning objectives, but then it's also what happens out of the classroom. So the extracurriculars, the clubs that you supervise, and what other opportunities do you have for students? I think especially now, an important one to have, and I've always thought was important, is looking at the decision to rent or buy a place, particularly if you're planning on staying for 3 or more years, and the cost of a mortgage and just the current cost of capital.
Time preferences. I think that's interesting. In Denmark, there's this idea about a generational theft. But when you actually look at the numbers, a 30-year-old today will have a 40% higher spending power than his parents or her parents had when they were 30 years old. So there's obviously they can't buy a house straight away, but neither could their parents, right? Like they also had to wait or get like a really expensive mortgage or something like that. But it seems a lot of young people are pretty impatient with these things, right? Would you agree with that? I
think so. And then there's a different dynamic from Denmark and the States because you have, basically free or extremely low interest rates on student loans. And in the States, sometimes we have 21-year-old students graduating from college who made a decision at 17 or 18 to take on $100,000 or $200,000 of debt. Now, that's the far side, but the average student debt is somewhere about $23,000 or $24,000, which puts you in the hole, especially now with inflation. In the U.S., we expect it to be 9% next month, year on year.
It's so scary. It is scary. This is another thing, actually. I don't think many business school students who graduated, say 3 years ago, thought much about inflation, right? But this is a new reality, right? So this might also be somewhere where some of the classics can help us a little bit to try to get that back into the classroom. Really interesting stuff. So I have a controversial question now. Let's see if you want to answer this. So I've noticed that in many business schools, they do tend to have programs called something like business and politics or or something along those lines. And when I look over those curriculum, I'm a little bit scared because they don't learn the bad side of politics often. They don't do public choice, right? It's all a positive idea about we can improve society if business and politics works together in some nirvana state or whatever. What's your thought about these programs, if you want to share them?
I think that's a really great question, because as you might remember, even at Academy of Management, our division was called Business Policy and Strategy up until a couple of years ago when it converted to just strategy. And a lot of the classic work in management did cover policy back then and government. Well, there's many ways to approach this. From a student perspective, we can point to government failures. For example, in Washington, D.C., our students used to get a free metro pass to use the metro, but the metro often didn't work or was delayed. And so, that's an example of a potential government failure that's highly subsidized. And then the students would take advantage of using scooters, Lyft, Uber, sometimes buying bicycles. So you can have those kinds of conversations with the students in class. And then it's important to talk to them about this phenomena of cronyism. Because a lot of students confuse, and also, frankly, faculty, not just in business schools, but in universities, they confuse capitalism, which are, the virtues that we've been talking about, with crony capitalism, which is all these extremely tight, sometimes often illegal government relations and kickbacks and so forth. And crony capitalism is the problem, but not capitalism. For students, the only time I see that when they're starting businesses and they notice crony capitalism is when they see that they're, larger, more established businesses that are in that sector, going into that sector that suddenly can win up, again, these public contracts and so forth. And then they become a little bit more skeptical.
Yeah. And you actually did some work on this whole area about cronyism and management costs. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or tell our listeners a little bit more about that.
Well, some of our co-authors on that paper are from Denmark. So Nikolai Foss, Peter Klein, Nikolai's at CBS, Peter Klein's at Baylor and the Norwegian School of Economics. Michael Holmes is at Florida State, and Justin Pepe's a Ph.D. student at Florida State. And we looked to try to clarify those terms about crony capitalism, because especially now in the management literature, we're so quick to criticize classic economic thought. There is, for example, a special issue of one journal coming out called Atlas Unplugged to basically take capitalism out of the input. I also find this fascinating because in my experience also as an associate dean, some of the professors who have those ideas, they still want capitalism in their pay structure, right? So they're not willing to not have pay raises and then pass on their salary, which is proportionally much higher than staff, or give it away to students, right? So the criticisms are of business, but not of their own organizations sometimes, which I think is interesting. So we tried to kind of highlight that. First, define cronyism, and our official definition is this system in which the business success hinges on relationships with government officials who provide the resources, the regulatory exemptions, and other benefits that are basically not available or less available to those who aren't as politically connected, whether as individuals or as firms. Now, some are legal, like lobbying and campaign contributions, but then you get into illegal activities like bribes and other influence tactics. And when this is unchecked, it's just reckless business practices, protecting firms from the consequences of misconduct, insulating firms from competition, discouraging innovation and economic growth.
So hearing this, could there be something, and this is maybe also a little bit controversial, but I think some of the greatest teachers I've known has been pro-market, but I also know that many classrooms, it can actually be controversial to be pro-market these days, right? So could it be that some of faculties are just jumping on a bandwagon to criticize big business and markets and so on because that's what the students want to hear? And if so, what's the remedy? What should we do instead?
I'm grappling with this issue. I think actually there are hundreds, if not thousands of faculty in the U.S. and abroad who are grappling with this issue because we are so fortunate to live in our country, the U.S. Denmark's another great democratic capitalist state. And we want to make sure that those values are still core because we see what happens in Venezuela and Cuba and other countries, North Korea, where, there's just sort of unchecked government power. I don't know. I think for each person it's different. I think there is sometimes pressures to sign maybe a manifesto.
Oh, yeah.
And then I think there are special issues now of journals that, can help one get promotion and tenure. And then there are organizations that support this. And I do think a lot of this is well-meaning, and I agree with many of the principles of this. But at the same time, if unchecked, it just creates a giant cronyistic system with a big government that suppresses ideas. And I haven't seen a lot of empirical research that indicates that this is actually something good for businesses and for organizations.
True. It's a bit of a conundrum how quickly this social phenomenon sort of impacted, right? And how powerful it is. Yeah, interesting.
And maybe we don't have exposure. So there have been so many good academics in lots of disciplines. I'm thinking Arthur Brooks, for example, who's shown that capitalism has been a great way to lift people out of poverty.
Yeah.
And somehow those stories are lost in something else, right? So I think we all have the same, we have a lot of the same motivations. For me, Florida Atlantic University is a beautiful place. 50% of our students are first generation college students or first generation Americans. So their families escaped from Haiti, Dominica, Colombia, and others. They can't afford a private school education, but our education with tuition fees is something like $6,400 US a year. It's really low. And we're one of the top schools in the country that propels them into the middle class and the upper middle class. Yeah. So for me, I also want to solve intergenerational poverty. I want people to be able to advance in society. And for me, it's about providing a really high quality business education with core economic principles that have been proven to work for centuries.
Yeah. I think I agree very much with that ambition. I think that's important. Do you think maybe sometimes with those who criticize free market ideas within business schools, is it a matter of not understanding causality? In the sense, if they see a social ill that they want to correct, and then they say, okay, this social ill happens to be in a capitalist society, therefore capitalism must cause this social ill, which would be an error of causality, probably, right? But do you think there's something in that?
I think there are probably lots of causality pieces. Yeah. Sometimes an N of one. I actually wrote about this years ago. I did a report for the World Bank on all the different ways that governments can help individuals and firms in business that actually result in really good outcomes, right? That you have more women returning to the workforce, earning money so that they can have their own property and their own lives. So I think people jump in with a case study of one sometimes, and they think, well, there was this whatever, and the outcome was good, and maybe the outcome was only observed immediately thereafter, and there was no control. So then they put forward these ideas, and it's really easy to jump on. Yeah. And when there's faculty who sign all these things, it's quite easy to just add your name to that versus try to explain why you wouldn't want to sign that, for example. Exactly.
Perfect. So speaking of social issues, you've done a lot of really interesting work on a really hot issue, at least in Denmark, probably globally, gender diversity in boardrooms. Can you give us a little rundown of what's at stake here? What do you know? What's going on?
Thank you, Stefan. This is a fascinating topic. I did my master's degree in Norway, and then I did my PhD in the UK. And it was during those times that Norway adopted its board gender quota. So I had a pretty front row seat to that. And this has been fascinating for many years. And of course, we now see something like 19 countries have quotas. There's lots of comply or explain legislation. We're seeing now in the U.S. the first states adopting quotas. So we're filming this in Nevada, but right next door is California. That was one of the first states, and Washington State up north. And I believe 5 other states are currently considering proposals. So by states, I mean U.S. states versus the states of countries. Fascinating topic. And there's been work on all angles on this topic. I want to highlight a few findings from our research that I think will be interesting. One is we did a study, this was with Yannick Tams and Barry Bendel, across U.S. states and looked at the levels of reproductive freedom historically in those states and the number of women sitting on boards later. Now, this is a little bit correlation, but maybe causation. But we could say that those states that gave women more reproductive freedoms over many years later had more women on the boards of firms headquartered in those states. So there's a real freedom argument there.
Oh, cool.
The most recent paper that we published did the county level in the U.S. So there are 50 states, and then states have counties depending on their size. I come from Ohio. We have 88 counties, but there are 3,006 counties in the U.S. And what we found is that states with greater levels of embedded social networks and civic norms also had more women on boards controlling, both these studies, controlling for all these other factors. And we measured the social networks and social capital and civic norms by the density of sports clubs, churches, nonprofits, Kiwanis, Toastmasters,
Cool.
Rotary, and then whether individuals completed the census or not, which we have to do every 10 years, and whether they voted in presidential elections, which are the big ones. And those counties that had the greatest levels of social capital also had more women on boards. So there was something to that. And I think there's also a COVID lockdown story to this as well, which is that we can't, unfortunately, in most places in the U.S., we aren't prohibiting groups from coming together, whether it's church or Kiwanis. My kids are in the Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts, and they love it. They're doing their track meets because that builds social fabric, gives people the ability to access human capital and social capital in addition to other skills, ends up on board. So those are two arguments for increasing individual freedom.
Yeah. Because this is sort of like the key of the issue, isn't it? Like I can understand why we would want a representative society on as many levels as possible, but if that's at the cost of hurting property rights of shareholders to decide who's in the board and so on, I mean, that's a big problem, right? So, and what you're saying is that actually, if we let society be free, representation will happen. Is that correctly understood?
We've seen that, certainly in the U.S., where we can measure these state-to-state differences. So I live in Florida, which is the number 2 most free state. Some would say number 1. New Hampshire is number 1. But boy, that's a pretty good state that my 2 boys and my 1 daughter could, have the opportunity to pursue whatever careers they wanted. But these quotas are now quite broad-ranging. So there have been many studies of quota effectiveness. The first one I did was in Spain, and Spain has a soft quota, which is different from Norway's hard quota. The soft quota is, well, if you don't get your representation of women on boards to such and such a level, you'll be less likely to win government contracts. So there you see the government piece. And what we found is that those companies that were more dependent on government contracts were more likely to increase the share of women on boards, but only a very small percent of them actually complied with the mandate. And even those that complied didn't necessarily win more contracts. So that data was 2007 to 2014, but we just didn't see any results. And then in Norway, we looked at those, and as you know, in Norway, this affected all publicly listed companies on the Oslo Stock Exchange. So those companies that were in the target group versus other companies that were similar in Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. And what we saw over time, this was a many-year study, was that the Norwegian firms didn't have better firm performance, and they didn't have better firm risk profiles as compared to those that didn't have the quota. Yeah. The quota in Norway is 40%, so that's quite significant. It's certainly a fascinating issue, and we need more studies. And of course, there are many ways to measure performance. I'm taking a financial perspective.
Of course. Yeah. Isn't it also something to do with life choices? If I'm to be a little bit of a devil advocate here on the social capital aspect, because I think this is really interesting. I mean, in many Western countries, there are now more educated women than men. There are no sort of legal boundaries for what women want to do, all these kind of things. And yet still we see an overrepresentation of men. How does that reflect to the social capital issue? Like the whole, because I'm guessing what I'm saying here, I think some women simply choose other lives, right?
Yeah. So we all choose other lives, right? Yeah. So especially people who are educated have just a repertoire of possibilities. Yeah. One theory from management is that we just take these career tournaments and we make decisions that are path dependent, and we move up and move up and move up. And at some stage, yes, we choose to potentially opt out of those. Yeah. In Denmark, in the US, most developed countries, more women than men have been in university education overall for many years. In certain fields, women may still lag men, but and in labor market participation, it's quite high, right? In fact, in some countries, you're almost ostracized if you don't have a dual income family structure. So, and yes, people opt in. So traditionally in the Scandinavian countries, and that's why you see, for example, Gro Harlem Brundtland and Erna now in Norway as prime ministers, is that these women opted into the public sector and moved up in government roles doing really neat stuff. Whereas men were more likely to be in the private sector. Now we see, and especially lots of research on women on board shows that women who have high-level government careers sometimes do come and serve on firms, whether it's in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, in the U.S. So those are some of the factors, I think.
Yeah. And also related to this is, I mean, I've done board work in my past. I worked in private equity and so on, and I'm also on a board now. And to me, a good board member has to know his financials or her financials, right? There's a skill set to this. You have to be able to read the accounts and hold the management accountable and all these kind of things. And that's not a skill set many people have, right? Like whether they're no matter what kind of gender they have, it's a very specific skill set that takes many years to learn, right? And it's a fairly boring skill set. Lots of time to learn it, right? I mean, I can understand why people want to do something else. I mean, right? Yeah. Do you think that plays into it?
That's a great question. It's funny because I was talking to a friend of mine about serving on a board the other day with another. He's a guy who sets up firms that are IPOing, and another woman who's a Harvard-educated attorney. And there's lots at play for careers. We know, for example, that these boards take a lot of service. And while you hear the outlier salaries, for example, it's like over $1 million to serve on the board of Facebook.
Or PepsiCo or something
like
that. Yeah.
But the average board pays somewhere around $48,000 to $68,000. So if you consider someone's, the average person with those skill sets might be able to earn that with considerably less work.
Good point.
And then also not have the associated risk of being a board director. So a few years ago, I looked at, what happened to those directors who were on Enron and Tyco and other firms in the U.S. that imploded, where it was well known. And about 50% of them kind of resurrected themselves and stayed active in the corporate sector, and 50% just disappeared after that.
Huge
so
drop
there's a risk.
Yeah, that's a huge risk. Yeah.
And then it's about finding the right fit and the right board. So in the US, we also have suggested board sizes as you do in Denmark, and our boards are larger than yours. But you want to make sure that you have that full set of skills. We call this resource dependency theory, that if you're a board and you need skills in this particular area, then that's the next director that you recruit. So that's certainly a factor as well.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah. So, for instance, if you're going through a digitization process, you want somebody who maybe have overseen that as a manager somewhere. And yeah, I can see that. I think this has been a really good chat. I think this topic is so interesting because a lot of the issues that's actually also played out in the history of economic thought is actually coming to a real life hit in these kind of debates, right? Once you understand them. I'd like to hear your last thought on something, then we'll finish up. So I generally think that people misunderstand boards. In my view, if a company is successful, all the credit goes to the management because they work there every day. If a company is unsuccessful, all the blame goes to the board. Right? It's actually a pretty thankless job, right? Would you agree with that assessment? I
think that's an interesting point, because when we look at, for example, the problem that Boeing had with the Air Max 737 MAX, that was attributed to not really having a safety person on the board, only one person from what was Continental Airlines many years ago, and not necessarily attributed to the management. The only engineers and managers who are featured in that discussion are the ones who raised the flag on it and were whistleblowing but weren't listened to. So yes, I think it could be a relatively thankless job.
Yeah, perfect. I'll put some links to some of your work in this area and some of your other work down in the show notes. And thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you. This was so fun.
Lovely. Thank you. So bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for listening or watching on YouTube.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us exploring the history of economic thought. You're very welcome to email comments and suggestions to Stefan@CEPOS.dk. Please like and share and recommend this podcast anywhere you can and think it's relevant. Until next time, stay rational.